A law with roots in pagan sun worship is still on the books across America, was upheld by the Supreme Court, and the legal door to enforce it again has never actually been closed. Today, we're pulling apart three things that most people have never connected: how Sunday laws could reemerge as forced worship, how Sunday-centered Christianity absorbed pagan customs it was never supposed to carry, and why the Saturday Sabbath, the one that predates Moses, the Ten Commandments, and even sin itself, remains something entirely different. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the legal, historical, and theological threads that tie all of this together. My conversation partner today has gone deep into these sources, and I want to start right at the nerve center of this whole thing. So, let's get into it.
Yeah, and the place to start is actually with a date most people know but don't think about: 321 AD. That's when Emperor Constantine issued the very first Sunday legislation. And here's the thing, he didn't do it as a Christian leader, he did it as Pontifex Maximus, which was the title of the supreme pagan high priest of Rome.
Wait, Pontifex Maximus? That's a title I've heard before, but I didn't know it had that kind of pagan weight behind it.
Right, and according to the historical record on Sunday legislation, that title traces all the way back to ancient Babylon. In Roman times, it goes back to Caesar Augustus. Every emperor after him took the title. And then, fascinatingly, in 533 AD, Emperor Justinian transferred the title of Pontifex Maximus to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. So the very office that would later enforce Sunday worship had pagan imperial roots.
So the first Sunday law wasn't a Christian act, it was a pagan imperial act dressed in Christian language.
Exactly. And the historical record is pretty blunt about this. It says the first Sunday legislation introduced into the Christian church was, quote, a product of the pagan conception fully developed by the Romans, which made religion a department of the state. And it goes on to say this was diametrically opposed to the principles of true Christianity as enunciated in the New Testament by Christ and the apostles.
That's a strong statement. So this wasn't Christianity shaping the law, it was the state shaping Christianity.
That's the core of it. And then it escalated. In 364 AD, the Council of Laodicea didn't just promote Sunday, it actually forbade the Sabbath and mandated Sunday observance. So within about 40 years of Constantine's law, you go from a civil Sunday preference to an ecclesiastical ban on the seventh-day Sabbath.
And that's the moment where the church-state fusion really locks in.
Exactly. And what's wild is that this legal architecture didn't disappear. It traveled through English history, into American colonial law, and Sunday closing laws, what people called blue laws, became embedded in American legal tradition. The Supreme Court actually upheld them in a 1961 case called McGowan v. Maryland.
Oh, I want to dig into that case because that's where it gets really interesting from a legal standpoint. What did the court actually say?
So the court acknowledged openly that historically these laws had a religious motivation and were designed to, quote, effectuate concepts of Christian theology. But then it said that as they evolved, they became secular in character. The court's reasoning was essentially, yes, Sunday has religious significance, but the state can still mandate it as a day of rest for secular reasons like ease of enforcement and giving communities a common day of leisure.
So they basically laundered a religious mandate into civil law by calling it secular.
That's a sharp way to put it, and the legal precedent still stands. The door was never closed. What's also striking is that the court noted the choice of Sunday reflected, quote, simple legislative inertia, meaning it wasn't even a fresh theological decision, it was just habit. Centuries of habit.
Legislative inertia. That phrase is doing a lot of work there.
It really is. And here's where the Adventist angle becomes relevant. Adventist historian David Trim, speaking at the 9th World Congress of the International Religious Liberty Association in 2023, described a real tension that early Adventists wrestled with. On one hand, they believed a national Sunday law would be a marker of the final eschatological scenario. On the other hand, they needed to be free from Sunday laws in their daily lives.
So they were caught between their own prophecy and their own freedom.
Precisely. And Trim noted that some early Adventist pioneers actually thought they should provoke a national Sunday law to, quote, oblige Christ to inaugurate the millennium by his second advent. But Trim was clear, the church as a whole never accepted that idea. He called it, quote, an idiosyncratic one. The idea that you could compel Christ to action.
That's a fascinating internal debate. Essentially, do we fight the law or do we let it happen because we think it's prophetically inevitable?
And they ultimately chose to fight it. The International Religious Liberty Association was launched in 1893 directly out of that commitment to oppose Sunday legislation. So there's a whole tradition of organized resistance to this that most people don't know about.
Okay, so let's pivot now to the second thread, because the legal history is one thing, but the theological and cultural corruption of Sunday worship is a whole other layer. How did Sunday become so central to Christianity in the first place?
So this is where the pagan absorption story gets really textured. According to Dr. E. Glenn Hinson, professor of church history at the Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond, in the earliest years of the church, up to about 70 AD, Jewish Christians dominated, and the influence of Judaism was strong. None of the early worship styles significantly reflected Greco-Roman customs.
So the pagan influence came later, not at the beginning.
Right. From the late 1st century onward, Gentiles began to outnumber Jews in the Christian assembly, and they brought with them, subtly, the ideas and customs of Greek and Roman culture. Christian missionaries also deliberately adopted pagan language and symbols to make the faith more attractive to Gentile hearers.
And Sunday worship was part of that package.
It was. Sunday was the day dedicated to the sun god in Roman culture. According to the research, early Christians adopted this day for their own religious observances. And it wasn't just the day, the halo in Christian art was borrowed from pagan sun iconography. December 25th aligned with the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. The name Easter is believed to derive from Eostre, a Germanic goddess of spring.
So it's not just Sunday, it's a whole constellation of absorbed symbols.
Exactly. And the early church father Tertullian actually noticed this in the 3rd century. He wrote about how the mystery religion of Mithras mimicked Christian sacraments, baptism, forgiveness of sins, resurrection symbolism. He was alarmed by it, but over time, rather than the church resisting those parallels, it absorbed them.
And that absorption is what the search results are calling the paganization of Christianity.
Yes. And what's important to understand is that this wasn't always malicious. Some scholars describe it as strategic. Early Christianity rebranded existing symbols to ease the transition for pagan populations. But the effect was the same. The original seventh-day Sabbath got replaced by a day with deep roots in sun worship, and that replacement was then enforced by law.
And here's what I find really striking. Cardinal Gibbons himself, whose archdiocese published the Catholic Mirror in Baltimore, essentially admitted there's no biblical basis for Sunday worship. What exactly did he say?
The Catholic Mirror in 1893, which was the official organ of Cardinal Gibbons's archdiocese, stated, quote, "The Catholic Church for over 1,000 years before the existence of a Protestant, by virtue of her divine mission, changed the day from Saturday to Sunday." And Gibbons himself is quoted as saying, "You may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single line authorizing the sanctification of Sunday."
That is an extraordinary admission. The institution that changed the day is openly saying the Bible never authorized it.
And that's not a fringe claim. That's from the official publication of a cardinal's archdiocese. It's in the historical record, and it lines up with what the comparative analysis of Sabbath versus Sunday shows. There are multiple explicit biblical commands for the seventh-day Sabbath: Exodus 20, Leviticus 23, Deuteronomy 5, Isaiah 58, and 0 verses commanding Sunday worship.
0. That's not a small gap.
It's not. And what's fascinating linguistically is that over 100 languages still call Saturday by a name derived from Sabbath. Hebrew, Shabbat; Arabic, As-Sabt; Spanish, Sabado; Russian, Subbota. The calendar itself, in most of the world's languages, still remembers what the church forgot.
That's actually kind of remarkable. The linguistic memory is still there even when the theological memory got overwritten.
Exactly. And the Sabbath's origin is even older than most people realize. According to Genesis 2, The 2:3, God rested on the seventh day, blessed it, and made it holy. This happened before sin entered the world, before the Jewish people existed as a nation, before the 10 Commandments were given at Sinai, and before Moses was born. It's a creation ordinance, not an ethnic one.
So the argument that the Sabbath is just a Jewish thing doesn't hold up historically.
Not at all. The St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology describes the Sabbath as an imitatio Dei, an imitation of God. Humanity rests because God rested. It's about reflecting God's character, not fulfilling an ethnic obligation. And that theological framing is completely different from Sunday, which entered the picture post-apostolically. The research indicates some Roman churches began meeting on Sunday in addition to the Sabbath around 100 to 200 AD, And it wasn't until Constantine's civil law in 321 that Sunday became legally mandated.
So the Sabbath predates everything, and Sunday came in about 300 years after the apostles died.
That's the timeline. And what makes the Sabbath theologically distinct isn't just its antiquity, it's its character. Jesus himself redefined what Sabbath observance looks like, and it's not what the Pharisees were enforcing.
Right, Jesus had some pretty pointed things to say about the Sabbath. Walk me through that.
So in Matthew 12, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. The Pharisees challenge him, and he responds, "How much more valuable is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And then in Mark 2:27, he makes the foundational statement, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath."
That's a complete inversion of how the Pharisees were using it. They made the Sabbath a burden. Jesus made it a gift.
Precisely. And in Luke 13, he heals a woman on the Sabbath and rebukes the synagogue leader, emphasizing the importance of setting people free from their burdens. So Jesus' Sabbath theology is consistently mercy outward. It's not about performance or restriction, it's about liberation and compassion.
And Isaiah 58 connects to this too, right? Because that passage is often cited in Sabbath discussions.
Isaiah 58, 1-3-14 is really the heart of it. It frames the Sabbath as a delight, not a duty. And the context of that whole chapter is fascinating because Isaiah 58 opens with God rebuking Israel for fasting and worshipping while ignoring the poor and oppressed. The chapter is essentially saying, your religious observance means nothing if it doesn't translate into feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, and setting the captive free. And then it says, if you call the Sabbath a delight, you'll find joy in God.
So the Sabbath in Isaiah 58 is inseparable from serving the least of people. It's not a retreat from the world, it's a reorientation toward the world's most vulnerable.
That's exactly it. And the Bible Hub's topical analysis of the Sabbath puts it this way. The Sabbath becomes a day to reflect God's character, which includes mercy, justice, and kindness. It aligns with Micah 6:8. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. The Sabbath isn't a withdrawal from people, it's a formation into God's image, which is a merciful image.
And that's the contrast with what Sunday worship became, which is more about emotional experience, performational belonging. Right. And when you trace how Sunday worship developed, absorbing pagan emotional and theatrical elements, being enforced by imperial law, becoming the centerpiece of state church power, you get something very different from what Jesus modeled on the Sabbath. The Sabbath, as Jesus practiced it, was unforced, mercy-centered, and oriented toward the marginalized. Sunday, as it developed institutionally, was enforced, emotionally managed, and oriented toward institutional power.
That's a stark contrast. And it raises a real question about what happens when worship becomes compulsory. Because the moment you legislate it, you've changed its nature. That's the theological core of the problem. Forced worship isn't worship, it's compliance. And the history of Sunday legislation is a history of compliance being mistaken for devotion. Constantine didn't create worshippers, he created a legal category. And the Supreme Court in 1961 essentially preserved that legal category while stripping it of its religious label.
And that legal category is still available. The McGowan v. Maryland precedent is still standing.
It is. And what's worth noting is that the court also struck down a state statute that tried to let employees choose their own Sabbath day because it was seen as having the primary effect of promoting religion. So the legal framework is actually more protective of Sunday than it is of individual conscience. That's the irony.
Wow. So the law protects the institutionalized day, but not the conscientious one. That's the legal reality as it stands. And that's why the Adventist tradition's long-standing commitment to religious liberty isn't just theological, it's practical. David Trim noted that the International Religious Liberty Association was born in 1893 specifically to oppose Sunday legislation. That's over 130 years of organized advocacy rooted in the conviction that conscience cannot be legislated.
And the Sabbath itself, as a practice, is the living alternative to that coercion. It's the thing that can't be faked because it's not about performance. That's a really important point. The Sabbath, as described in the biblical sources, is defined both negatively, abstaining from work, and positively, worshipping God and serving others. The St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology describes it as imitatio Dei. You rest because God rested. You serve because God serves. It's formation, not performance.
And that formation piece is what gets lost when worship becomes emotionally driven and institutionally managed.
Exactly. When worship is about generating an emotional experience, which is what a lot of Sunday-centered Christianity has become, it tends to be self-referential. The congregation is the audience. But the Sabbath, as Jesus modeled it, is other-directed. The congregation goes out. The sick get healed. The burdened get freed. The hungry get fed.
And Isaiah 58 makes that connection explicit. You can't separate the Sabbath delight from the justice work.
You can't. And that's what makes the Sabbath so countercultural today. In a world where religion is increasingly about brand, experience, and emotional resonance, the Sabbath says, slow down, stop producing, and go find the person who needs you most. That's the image of God you're supposed to reflect.
Let me bring in something from the Pew Research data here, because it's relevant to this conversation about what faith communities actually do. Pew found that more than half of Black American churchgoers, 55%, say helping the needy with food, bills, and housing is a key function of their house of worship. That's a community that has maintained the mercy-centered vision of faith even within Sunday worship traditions.
That's a really important counterpoint, and it shows that the mercy impulse can survive even within traditions that adopted Sunday. The question isn't whether Sunday worshippers can be merciful. Clearly many are. The question is whether the institutional and legal framework of Sunday worship was built on that mercy foundation or on something else entirely.
And the historical record says it was built on imperial power and pagan sun worship, not on mercy.
That's what the sources show. Constantine's Sunday law came from his role as Pontifex Maximus, the pagan high priest. The Council of Laodicea's ban on the Sabbath came from ecclesiastical power consolidation. None of that has mercy at its root. The mercy came from individual believers who carried it despite the institutional framework, not because of it.
That's a really important distinction. The people can be merciful even when the institution isn't built on mercy.
And that's actually hopeful, because it means the Sabbath's mercy-centered vision isn't locked away in a tradition that most people don't practice. It's accessible. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, for all of humanity. It's a gift that predates every institution, every law, every empire.
And it's a gift that can't be enforced without destroying what it is.
That's the paradox at the center of this whole conversation. The moment you legislate the Sabbath, or any day of worship, you've turned a gift into a tax. And history shows us exactly what that looks like. Constantine's Sunday law, the Council of Laodicea's ban, the American Blue Laws upheld in 1961, coercion dressed as devotion.
So when you step back from all of this, the legal history, the pagan absorption, the mercy theology, here's what really comes into focus. We're not just talking about which day of the week you go to church. We're talking about the difference between worship that forms you into God's image and worship that performs for institutional power.
That's the real stakes. And the three threads we've traced today all point to the same conclusion. Sunday legislation has a legal architecture that was never dismantled. McGowan v. Maryland is still precedent. Sunday worship has a cultural architecture that was built on pagan absorption and imperial enforcement. And the Sabbath has a theological architecture that was built before any of that. At creation, before sin, before nations, before law.
And the Sabbath architecture is mercy. Healing on the Sabbath, feeding the hungry on the Sabbath, setting the burden free on the Sabbath. That's what Jesus modeled, and that's what Isaiah 58 describes.
And what's striking is that the Sabbath doesn't need a law to sustain it. It doesn't need an emperor or a council or a Supreme Court ruling. It sustains itself because it's rooted in who God is and in who God is calling his people to become. That's a very different foundation than legislative inertia.
Legislative inertia. That phrase from the Supreme Court's own ruling is haunting when you sit with it. The most widely observed day of Christian worship in the world is, by the court's own admission, the product of habit, not revelation.
And Cardinal Gibbons said you won't find a single line in the Bible authorizing it. That's not a fringe theologian. That's the official publication of a cardinal's archdiocese in 1893. The admission is in the record. The question is whether people are willing to look at it.
And that's the invitation this conversation is really making. Not to panic about Sunday laws coming back, though the legal door is open, but to ask, what is the worship I'm practicing actually built on? Is it built on formation and mercy, or on habit and institutional momentum?
That's the question worth sitting with, because the Sabbath as a practice, resting, reflecting God's character, doing works of mercy, serving the least, that's available to anyone. It doesn't require a denomination or a building or a law. It requires a decision to stop, to rest, and to go find the person who needs you.
And that's the thing that no law can manufacture. You can legislate a day off. You can't legislate the mercy that's supposed to fill it.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Sabbath so resilient across millennia. Empires tried to replace it, councils tried to ban it, courts tried to secularize it, and it's still here, still described in over 100 languages by its original name, still pointing back to the seventh day, still calling people to rest and reflect and serve.
Here's what this really comes down to. A law that started with a pagan emperor is still on the books. A day of worship that absorbed sun god symbolism is still the default. And a Sabbath that predates all of it, that Jesus himself practiced and redefined as mercy, is still waiting to be rediscovered. That's not a small thing.
It's not. And the actionable insight here is simple. Trace the roots of what you practice. Not to condemn anyone, but to understand what you're actually standing on. Because the foundation matters, especially when the legal and cultural pressures around worship start to shift.
And those pressures are real. The McGowan v. Maryland precedent is still standing. The legal category is still available. The history of Sunday legislation shows it can come back dressed in secular language, and most people won't even notice.
Which is why the Adventist tradition's 130-year commitment to religious liberty advocacy matters. Not because they have all the answers, but because they've been asking the right question for a very long time. Can conscience be legislated? And the answer, consistently, is no.
Conscience cannot be legislated. Worship cannot be forced. And the Sabbath, the one that was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, is still there, still rooted in creation, still defined by mercy, still waiting.
And maybe that's the most surprising thing in this whole conversation. The oldest day of rest in human history is also the most radical alternative to everything that's been built on top of it. It doesn't need an empire, it doesn't need a law, it just needs people willing to stop, rest, and serve.
We started this episode by saying a law with roots in pagan sun worship is still on the books, and the door to enforce it has never been closed. Here's the thing, the door to the Sabbath has never been closed either. It's been there since Genesis 2, and unlike the Sunday law, nobody had to force it on anyone. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts.